Hello and welcome to another episode of Rational Actors on Blogging Heads. I'm Kevin Glass, managing editor at Town Hall, and today I am joined by
Ben Domenech. I'm the publisher at the Federalist and a senior fellow at the Heartland Institute.
Yeah, thanks for being with me today, Ben. I have a couple different topics we want to cover, but first, the story that's been kind of lighting up the media and journalism world over the last few weeks. Finally, after a couple weeks of rumors, Ezra Klein, who is the blogging master over at the Washington Post, left for, it was an as yet unnamed venture when it was announced that he was leaving, but he's teaming up with Vox Media to start a new kind of, it's being described as an explaining the world type of news website. So as someone who, you have a lot of experience with this, starting up, launching, building brands for websites and building up audiences, I wanted to get, I guess first your just preliminary thoughts on what kind of challenges that Ezra's going to face, building up an entirely new web presence.
Well, thank you for sort of asking me to weigh in on this. I guess the thing that sort of comes to mind first is that, you know, when it comes to breaking away from sort of a major media entity like the Washington Post, I think that there's going to be a lot of challenges for Ezra. And I think that there's been sort of an unfortunate thing that's happened where a lot of media coverage of what's gone on over the past couple of months in terms of the transitions that have happened, the new entities that have been starting up, they've all been glommed together into being sort of the same thing, when in reality they're very different in terms of the product offerings that they have. For instance, there's been a lot of coverage that's compared Ezra and Nate Silver from the New York Times, and then who shifted over to ABC and ESPN. Nate Silver offers a very different product in terms of what he actually puts out there compared to somebody like Ezra. Silver offers something that is essentially akin to being a, Las Vegas prognosticator, on the horse races or on sports or something of that nature. And I think that that's a very different product offering in a number of different ways. First off, there's sort of an empirical measure of success where if you don't actually deliver on the promises that you've made, if you don't actually match up with the outcomes, then people will turn away from you. But there's also sort of a numbers component to it that requires a lot of work and different work, I think, than what you would necessarily see under a continuation of sort of explanatory journalism or the kind of analysis that you've seen from Ezra and from Matthew Iglesias over the course of the past few years. I think that one of the things that's really key to understand about this new venture is that you're really kind of putting out there and testing how important Ezra's brand is in terms of being able to drive people to his new entity, but also what he's going to be able to offer in terms of insight beyond just sort of ticking off all the necessary boxes from kind of a Washington, D.C. centric way. This was a story that attracted a lot of attention inside the Beltway, but I'm not sure that as many outside the Beltway readers are engaged in the kind of offerings that Ezra's put forth in the past. And so I think he may have to expand outside of those offerings in the future in order to be able to have something that could truly be kind of a mass media enterprise. Vox Media, the place that he's partnered with, has done some great work in terms of building up websites like The Verge and SB Nation that have really neat sort of interactive content and content that really sort of is very responsive to the social web. But I'm not sure if that sort of is going to transfer over into the policy sphere, or if Ezra is really going to be limited to that sphere when it comes to sort of the focus of what this new enterprise is going to be about. I think it is difficult to build up, sort of a real following without solid content that is responsive to what the people actually want to read and interact with. And so this is going to be a new test for him. It's going to be a test of sort of whether he can break away from the Washington Post brand. I said in the past when I gave an interview with Matt Lewis right at the launch of the Federalist, and I said that I thought it would be a good idea for Ezra to sort of test out these assumptions and break away from kind of the old media entities. And I was a little surprised that he hadn't done it yet, in the sense that people like Andrew Sullivan, people like Nate Silver had. Now he's done it. We're going to find out whether he's going to be successful at it or not. And I'm curious to see, frankly, what kind of content and what kind of focus they have going forward.
Yeah, the good thing is that we will be able to test the success of his ability to break away from an established media brand. Hopefully soon. They don't have a launch date, but we will have a concrete product in our hands. I think that you're onto something with the distinction between Nate Silver and Ezra Klein in some ways. But to me, and this is just taking, a 10,000-foot view of the situation, what they do is they provide kind of educated political analysis for people who are on the internet in their leisure time, right? And to a certain ideological demographic, right? It's generally center-left liberals who are reading Ezra Klein and Nate Silver. That's not to say that their analysis is inherently left liberal. It just, they do tend to attract those people, and in some cases it is, and in some cases it isn't. But to the extent that, the content they're providing is, or have been providing at least in the past, is words on a page about politics, right? You get down into it, and like you said, Nate Silver does provide a fundamentally different product from Ezra Klein, but I think to a certain extent they're still going after the same demographic and the same leisure time that people are using to, read things on the internet. It will be interesting, I think, to see if Ezra does move away from the type of content that he's provided in the past, right? So he has been, let's say, words on a page or charts and graphs on a page or things like that. But I do think that his partnership with Vox is probably a unique opportunity to expand out beyond what he has traditionally provided in terms of content. Vox does do a lot of interesting things when it comes to web design. Their other properties certainly are more web-focused than the Washington Post. Obviously, the Washington Post is a legacy media organization that comes from physical newspapers, and we've seen that it takes a while sometimes for those types of media organizations to have a distinct web property from a physical newspaper. Vox doesn't have that problem, and I think that they'll provide Ezra with a more, I think, flexible platform for him to kind of flex his muscles in terms of what he wants to provide, right? But I do want to get your thoughts on where, this type of journalism is headed in the future, because it seems to have, we saw an evolution from personal blogs into brand blogs, into policy blogs, into almost a kind of traditional journalism on the internet. And I'm curious to know where you think that that's going in the future and what this new project might be able to contribute to that ongoing ecosystem.
There's a lot of interesting stuff there in the sense that you've touched on a transition, I think, that has taken place online. It hasn't really received a lot of attention in terms of sort of you had a lot of people who moved from being consumers of online content to being prosumers, to being people who developed that content themselves, and to being people who are actually now professionally sort of employed creating this kind of content. And I think that this is sort of a new era, for online journalism in a lot of different ways. You have a lot of people who've made this transition from being bloggers, in many cases, sort of joke bloggers, or people who just made fun or ranted about things.
Snark bloggers or smarm bloggers.
Exactly. To being serious journalists or semi-serious journalists, in the sense that they've reached a point where suddenly there are rules attached to the way that they engage with others and the way that they're going to sort of go about their business, and many of them have advertisers who care sort of about what the bounds of their snark and smarm sort of runs up against. I think one of the things that is really sort of going to be a test of this venture, and is a test of I think a lot of new ventures, is that right balance between sort of being snarky about the things that you're sort of engaging with and providing full analysis and sort of a comprehensive look from a journalistic standpoint. I think that this is something that, the Free Beacon certainly, wrestles with. We at Federalist wrestle with it, I would say, regularly in terms of the type of content that we're producing. Does this go over the line? Is this too insidery? Is this too snarky? Is this too, sort of negative without having a real, sort of focus to it? And I'll be curious to see the kind of content that's created there. You are talking about, I think, an arena that is going to go through a lot of changes over the next couple of years. We have a whole generation of new journalists who have grown up with the internet as opposed to in the pre-internet age, or in an age when the internet was, America Online, or essentially insulated from the reality of sort of what they're doing with. And I think that is a big part of the change, but they're also growing up in an era of the social web. Now, you can joke about this. I mean, there's the assumption that, social media is something that starts with teenage girls, just sort of talking to each other, and that inevitably moves to a point where the adults come into the room and all the teenagers, sort of disappear like cockroaches. I think that one of the things that's sort of happening right now is that you're seeing what it's like to have journalists who are used to immediate feedback on their stories, as opposed to being sort of insulated from that, where they would get letters to the editor in the old days. Now they get instantaneous tweets or Facebook messages, on their content. And that changes the way that they write. It changes the way that they engage with their readers. And it changes the way that I think they prioritize aspects of stories and things of that nature. They're looking for a different audience. They're different titles that'll work on Facebook as opposed to Twitter, and they're different titles that'll work with search as opposed to social media. And so because of that, I think it's changing the way that a lot of writers engage with their readers and think about the content that they're creating before they go about creating it. So we are in this sort of interesting transition period, and I think that Ezra's new venture is certainly part of that. I think Nate Silver's is as well. And I think that that's frankly good for journalism. I think it's good to have some entities that are built from the ground up, focused on the internet and on giving the people what they want in terms of a social based sort of content creation machine that actually is responsive to the things that people are interested in reading, as opposed to just pushing content out there and having no real awareness of where the eyeballs are going on the newsprint page. And I think that there's a lot of legacy media organizations that have struggled with this challenge over the years. And so, Ezra's now reached the point where he's saying, I'm done with the legacy media. I'm going to have a startup of my own, effectively backed by people who've known how to do it within the other spaces of sports and tech journalism and things of that nature. And that's an exciting thing. I think it's an exciting sort of opportunity to test, the knowledge that we have about the way that these things work, and put out to and hopefully interested readership, the types of new content that they may not even know that they want to read yet.
I think, you're onto a lot there. The growth of, I think, how you market your brand in the last few years, it has been kind of astounding when you think about it. You noted the kind of distinction between writing headlines for search engines versus writing headlines for social media. And you're right that social media is way beyond just, teenagers talking to themselves about what they ate. It's a massive, massive driver of traffic right now. And there are entire organizations basically devoted to getting that kind of traffic. So, from, I think, the 2005 to 2010 era, SEO, search engine optimization, was a huge business, and that's almost come crashing down recently. And especially you look at Upworthy. We make fun of Upworthy, but they're a traffic monster because they write headlines and about topics that make people want to click on share on Facebook or tweet or whatever. So whereas in the past, a headline like what this single mother did will inspire you to go out and do something in the world, is the worst SEO headline you can imagine. No one is ever going to search for that. But that headline is what gets people sharing on Facebook and Twitter and whatever, and that's what gets millions and millions of page views in and of itself. So it's a weird, but that's not to say search engine traffic has gone away, and in fact, far from it. I think that social media has just replaced people typing your homepage into their address bars. So instead of me booting up a browser and saying, I'm going to go to thefederalist.com, I'm going to go to thenewrepublic.com, I'm going to go to townhall.com, and I'm going to have all those open, I'm going to read what's on there. I go to my Facebook feed, or I open up Twitter, and I see what other people are sharing. So rather than self-aggregating, I'm outsourcing the aggregating to this giant network of people that some of them I know in real life, some of them I don't know, but they're people whose opinion I respect and I want to read. So in that sense, I think that a personal brand like Ezra Klein's will probably be very successful because he is, in and of itself, and you have experience with this as well, he is trusted as an aggregator, basically. You know, his morning email is very successful. People go there to just read him saying, look at these other important things there are to read on the internet. And there's value in that. And
what you're touching on there, I think, is that there's so much content flowing through the internet every day that people are looking for someone to help them sort of navigate it. You're doing that when you use Facebook. You're doing that when you use Twitter. And then there's some people who are willing to sort of go the extra step and pay for aggregation. You know, what I do with the Transom, the morning email that I've written for about 2 years now, is, you know, really try to aggregate the economic and policy news of the day, and analyze it a little bit and then provide people with a bunch of different links that sort of are just interesting things that I think are worth noting. I think that what's really interesting is that we've reached a point where there's so much content that some people are willing to actually pay to have somebody sort of sort through all of these things, and keep them from having to take the time to, you know, sort through everything in all of their feeds and you know, are concerned, frankly, about, you know, missing something maybe if they step away from things for too long. What's really incredible about this is that, you know, we've gotten to a point now where there's just so much, you know, some of it's really good writing. Some of it's just, you know, interesting news that could fly, you know, right past you if you step away from Twitter for 2 hours. And so they're kind of paying, other people to monitor these things for them. And it's interesting because, frankly, it's comparable to something like the old hotline from National Journal, which I used to read every day at lunch when I was a Capitol Hill staffer, which would sort through all the different political news and policy news within a ton of different areas. And it's sort of comparable to that, but for a wider audience, for an audience that's sort of external to Washington, to give them background on everything that's going on in their world. And I think that one of the things that's, you know, sort of interesting about what's going to happen with Ezra, interesting about what's going to happen with this new project, is how much of that they're going to do, whether they're going to try to sort of push into doing sort of long-form journalism, whether they're going to try to do what SB Nation has done for sports analysis, but within the policy sphere, which is going to be harder, frankly, because you don't have the visual feedback that you get every night of being able to produce images and graphics from the various sporting activities. You know, one of the things that's really sort of, you know, a big question about this is how much there's an audience for a kind of journalism which is engaged within kind of the social sphere, is trying to make things that are appealing and attractive to lay people and not just kind of the political insider community, but done in a way that resembles more the way that you see coverage of sports and entertainment and things of that nature. You always have kind of the driving force of the way that these places pay their bills being that coverage of things that are sort of less serious or you know, less have less import to sort of the economy or to politics, and then that funds sort of the political and news journalism that you do. But in the new sort of reality that we have, is that still going to be the case? Maybe we can find ways to make political and economic news and policy news more interesting, more shareable, more reactive to what people actually want to read, and tell some human interest stories that'll actually get them engaged. As opposed to speaking in sort of dry terminologies. Or maybe we just throw a bunch of charts up there and see if people will click on histograms. It's not necessarily something that we know the answer to before we try it. And, the market's going to respond to this, and we'll see what they react to.
Right. I'm really interested in where Vox, whoever the corporate bigwigs are at Vox, see this going themselves, right? Because they could see it as like you said, we want a very popular, a very page view driven, traffic monster, and anything less than that we consider a failure. And I'm not familiar with their internals at all. I assume that SB Nation is a fairly successful enterprise. I'm not sure about The Verge. I know it's well respected, and I love a lot of the work they do. But it'd be interesting to see if they consider this new political news project as something that is worthy of subsidization to get their kind of brand respectable, or if they see it as something that should be rivaling, SB Nation in terms of page views and value per employee. But what would be interesting, and like you said, I would think that they will do a lot of experimentation, and that's going to be key in their success. It depends on what's going to be getting them traffic. So Ezra took Dylan Matthews, who was an assistant at Wonk Blog at the Washington Post for him, and he had this interesting project that was almost an Upworthy style competitor at the Washington Post, that, according to some media reports, was already a traffic monster in a couple months of existence. And all it was kind of a headline that was provocative and shareable, and a chart or a graph or a video or something like that would get people's interest, and then kind of a link to the original source. So it was this massive aggregation project based heavily on a very visual element. And so I would imagine that they'll be doing something similar along those lines, where it might just be a section of the site is this visual element that's very simplistic, but will generate a lot of page views, and a lot of experimental long-form stuff that might experiment with the boundaries of web design as we've seen it. Because I know The Verge does a lot of interesting stuff there. I'm not sure how much traffic it gets, but I know I go to The Verge maybe once a month and find something that is just like laid out in a way that I would never have imagined someone would use. And certainly not a legacy media organization like the Washington Post would use. It's kind of this pushing the boundaries of what we would consider a multimedia story on the internet. So I will be interested to see how Vox sees this investment, and how much leash they're given to explore exactly what it is we want to think that online journalism is in, the year 2014.
One of the things that's sort of interesting as kind of a side thing to this, we've reached a point now where the tracks that sort of people go in their careers, are really sort of atypical to sort of the way things used to go. And I think that we've, reached a point where, particularly within media, the assumptions that you have about sort of the tracks that people will take are very different. I think that there are few people who thought when, Ezra jumped from the American Prospect to the Washington Post that he'd be leaving to start his own venture someday or something along those lines. Or that, when Nate Silver was just a blogger back in the day talking about this stuff, that ESPN and ABC would be in a bidding war with the New York Times over where he would go. I think that, content creation is really shifting in a big way, and people don't really fully grasp yet the kind of seismic change that's happening within the media space. And that's one of the reasons why I think we need more institutions and more entities built that are focused on the web first, that are built for the web, that are built for the way that people behave on it and the way they read on it, as opposed to institutions that are, just trying to put their same same content that they had in their print, journals or in newspapers up on the web in order to get attention. I just don't think that model really works anymore, and that's one of the reasons why, places like Javelin that designed the Federalist, and redesigned Foreign Policy, and have done a bunch of other sort of magazine redesigns, are very big on sort of putting the social first, but also creating very clean designs that people can interact with well. I think one of the things that we don't really fully grasp yet is how much we've moved away from kind of the old career tracks within media, and now getting to points where people can become publishers or start up entities, get enough income from the type of investors who are interested in this, either from a philanthropic side or from a business side, more so in the sports world or in entertainment than in news and politics. But either way, you can get enough critical mass to be able to sell the idea of creating these entities and occupying a space that really didn't exist before in terms of the kind of presence they had. It's comparable, I think, in a lot of ways to the kind of magazine startups that happened back in the day. When Bob Tyrrell was starting up the American Spectator, or when William F. Buckley was starting National Review. You needed these kind of personalities at the center of it to sort of get something off the ground, to get the kind of investment needed, to get the kind of working capital needed, and then to sort of put forward kind of a brand identity in terms of what you represented. I think that this is sort of the next generation of that, the same sort of thing happening, but happening within the web. And it'll be interesting to see, sort of which ones are successful, which ones play out, and what they come to be identified with in terms of the type of things that they're putting forward. And if you're just putting forward an image with an aggregation sort of component, you can become a traffic monster like you described, but you may not have all that much impact in terms of the way that you're, affecting the conversation in Washington or driving policy, if that's your focus. If you just want to be a traffic monster, then you can do that too. But it may not end up, sort of paying off the way that you'd like. I think there's a reason why, sort of BuzzFeed took the steps that it did over the past couple of years, to branch out from beyond, the kind of, lists of, listicles that they had sort of used in the past. They could be a perfectly happy listicle company and not have the politics component at all. But they decided to sort of go the way that they did, and I think they did for a reason.
I actually think that the Washington Post seems to be one of the kind of legacy print publications that made a good enough jump into the online world. Probably better than many other major newspapers. I mean, I don't think that the New York Times uses their online version all that well. The LA Times doesn't. The Houston Chronicle that I grew up with is dying. But the Washington Post seems to have done a much better job in creating an online presence. And specifically, actually, around Ezra Klein's Wonk blog. There are times that I go there and I'm reading a piece, and it's by a journalist that I had no idea ever wrote for Wonk blog. And it's that ability for them to be more flexible between their newspaper and their online, like you said, that I think has made them successful. And it's not just putting what your print edition was on the internet in the most organizable way. It's really coming up with a different product that is, built under your brand, but is still fundamentally different. Because if people wanted the newspaper, they would probably get the newspaper, but that's not what they want online. But it is interesting, I think. I think you're right that more organizations need to be built online from the ground up without those legacy implications. And BuzzFeed is a really good example of that, in that they were a weird viral site that had funny pictures and Reddit farming and stuff like that. And then they built a serious news organization kind of on top of that. by going out and hiring experienced and respected journalists who do very good work. But their political news operation is certainly not the traffic generator that the rest of BuzzFeed is, that the cat listicles are. But at the same time, because of that, they're able to kind of sustain their operation, and in a way that legacy media organizations haven't been able to with the rise of the internet. So it'll be interesting to see who survives this next round of online news creation, right? Because there have been a lot more serious competitors with well-designed sites that have popped up in the last few years. And we'll see if, this is the last gasp of print, especially as it really looks like a lot of print publications have struggled to make that transition.
There is sort of a struggle there, and I think, obviously it's driven by the fact that, if anything, we have Craigslist to thank for this. We have the destruction of the newspaper model of print advertising and classifieds to thank for the reality that we have today in terms of the shift to online sources. I think that one of the things that we haven't really figured out, though, is that, what we're going to do in terms of sustaining these online enterprises, if they're not just philanthropic endeavors, beyond just sort of page views and typical ad content. The Transom is obviously built on a subscription model. I think that subscription models are going to become more frequent in terms of the way that people engage with content going forward. I think you're also going to see more conferences and more, sort of tie-in events and that kind of thing. In the same way that sort of the music industry has shifted away from, the sales of albums and things of that nature to being more interested in concert tickets and that kind of thing. And
they're more interested in subscription models, Spotify and
yes.
RDO and the new Beats music. These are paid subscription services.
Exactly, and I think that that's telling in the sense that people are recognizing it's not so much that people are unwilling to pay for things. It's that you have to offer them the opportunity to pay for them in a different format or in a different way than they were existing previously. I've been a Spotify user for, probably 8 months or something like that now. And it's changed the amount of music that I buy. It's completely justified in the sense that I was spending more than that each month to buy music anyway.
Right.
But it's one of these things where, that a shift to that model changes the way that you interact with these things. But I think it also is responsive in the sense that this is the way that people would prefer to interact with them as opposed to having to go through, some kind of rigmarole in terms of paywalls or have, a dozen different ads thrown at them in terms of what they're doing. So I think that this is very interesting in terms of the direction that we're going. And I think that it's also something that, is hard to sort of say whether this is going to be something that's going to be able to be, sufficiently responsive to the demands of what people are saying and what they're interested in, whether we're going to be able to see the kind of content creation that we haven't seen in the past in terms of the flexibility of what's being created, how responsive it is to what people want, and whether it actually delivers in terms of digging into issues the same way that sort of the old print journalism did, or some things of that nature.
Yeah. Now I want to move on for now to the State of the Union, which happened last night, and I don't think that there was all that much surprising that I saw, except for one thing that we'll get to. But I wanted to kind of get your take on what you thought of, I guess, the message. Was there anything surprising? Do you think that, the State of the Union is a giant spectacle, and we've seen a fairly large backlash against that in the last few years. But your thoughts on kind of the agenda that President Obama laid out, and if there's anything that really surprised you.
There's not that much that really surprised me. The only thing that I would say is that I was a little surprised he wasn't a bit more aggressive in terms of pushing his agenda or in trying to put Republicans sort of between a rock and a hard place on an issue or two. The one thing that I would say about Obama at this point in his presidency is I just think that he's a very, sort of diminished figure compared to what we thought he would be as a president. I think that when you look back at his presidency, with the exception of Obamacare, I don't think that there's anything that is really lasting about it. I think that, essentially he's a guy who's, if you really drill down to what he's achieved, he's hiked taxes on rich people. He's bailed out a couple of places. He's done a few sort of nibbling things on the edge of environmental policy. He's appointed some judges, and he's killed some people with drones. I mean, that's really it. When you sort of look back at sort of the kind of presidency that he's had, it's not the kind of dramatic change that he promised the country, and that I think a lot of people really expected from him. They really had faith in him to be able to achieve it. And so it's unfortunate in the sense that I think we've reached a point where this is a guy who's just dramatically diminished from what he had promised the American people, and is really, I think, at this point, a kind of a creature of Washington in a really bad way. He's kind of reverting to the sort of senatorial type, as it were. And I think that that's a problem, because I think that this is a guy who, had a lot of hopes from an entire generation invested in him, and has really, turned up, with not a lot to actually show in terms of what he's delivered on. And I think that what this means in terms of what we're looking at going forward over the next 3 years, I just don't think that he's going to achieve anything in terms of the kind of agenda that he thought he could at the beginning of his second term, or at least said that he thought he could. When it comes to gun control, when it comes to immigration, when it comes to the environment, when it comes to any of these other sort of big picture issues, I just don't think that he's going to really shift all that. I think instead you sort of view this second term as being an entirely defensive endeavor. He was elected to defend Obamacare and to keep that, in place. But I think that, in terms of a legacy, is far less significant than what a lot of people had hoped his legacies would be when he first got into office.
Right. I want to defend Obama for a moment. I think you're right. There's definitely a narrative there where President Obama comes to Washington as he comes to Washington in 2004, but he's elected president as a great reformer who a lot of people have a lot of high hopes about. And I think he had some high hopes about them too. But the thing is, I think that he achieved them. The healthcare reform, I'm going to give it more credit than you. I think that it's once it's up and running and kind of stable-ish, it'll become the status quo. Some people won't like it, some people will, but people are afraid of change, and any kind of change in any direction from Obamacare is going to have that dreaded, you're going to lose your doctor, you're going to lose your insurance plan aspect to it, which has now become kind of a litmus test for healthcare reform, because it was a promise, and it was broken, and people don't like that. But he achieved a lot of things in his first 2 years, and I think that President Obama thought he could continue achieving things once Republicans came into office by sheer force of personality. That personality and his personal, very high poll numbers were going to force Republicans to fold, and it didn't. And Republicans who took the House in 2010 have been largely beholden to their base, for better or for worse. I think largely for better. And they've put basically a stop on his agenda, and the action items that President Obama pushes in Congress largely don't go anywhere now because Republicans don't share the same values that President Obama shares. But I think that he learned that very quickly after the 2010 elections. I think that that he knew in 2012 that what 2012 was about was preserving his first-term legacy. Because if he lost, President Romney would probably be able to dismantle a lot of Obamacare. But he won, and he's going to implement and defend Obamacare. He's going to defend a lot of and I think that the stimulus was a huge achievement for progressives. He's going to defend a lot of the programs that were put in place in the stimulus, and that's basically all he has to do to secure a fairly powerful legacy among liberals. I think that Obamacare is going to be a fairly stable, if not very good, status quo for a long time. And we look at the standing that Lyndon Baines Johnson has with progressives today because he implemented Medicare. And Medicare might look like a fiscally unsustainable disaster right now, but he's still lionized for that transformation of our healthcare system. And I think that President Obama will be as well, because I think that Obamacare is going to be I think that it's not a good policy, but I think that once it's working-ish, it'll be pretty easy to defend against attacks on it, because any way of dismantling at this point will require a lot of disruption to the healthcare system. And President Obama and the Democrats were able to kind of hide those disruptions once they passed it. And I think that the revelation of the disruption that has occurred is going to have a long memory in Americans' minds.
Well, I think that somewhere Ted Cruz is probably burning you in effigy right now, Kevin, as a rhino betrayer on the issue of Obamacare. But
I think that it's a bad policy, and I think it should be overturned. But I think that Americans will be upset when and if it gets overturned.
Here's the thing that I think about Obamacare. I think that Obamacare's impact on the American people is actually a lot less than in terms of the actual increase in the number of people who are insured. I think it's going to be well behind the kind of estimates that we've seen overall. I think the most significant aspect of Obamacare has turned out to be the Medicaid expansion, both in terms of it being something that the states are used to sort of doing in terms of signing people up, and in terms of the impact that it's actually going to have in terms of health access and that sort of thing. But the problem is that the Medicaid expansion is also something that requires the states to pony up money. We're going to see significant increases in state taxes because of it. It's also something that deals with people who, frankly, in terms of a statistic, don't really vote. And I think that that's an issue that sort of is going to be problematic in years to come as Medicaid squeezes state budgets, requires states to cut back on things like roads and schools, and runs into the problem of being an entitlement for sort of lower class and working class Americans that doesn't extend all the way up into the middle class, and because of that is going to create a lot of different tensions in these states. I think that Obamacare as a whole is going to achieve a heck of a lot less than what the president promised. I think the president essentially promised the American people it was going to be positive for everybody. That the only experience you would have in terms of losing your plan or losing your doctor would be that your premiums would go down, or that you would be in a better get a better network or be with a better doctor. Paul Krugman said the other day that the story about Tom Coburn losing his cancer specialist was a garbage story. I think that's pretty tone deaf in the sense that I think it doesn't really understand the way that people interact with their doctors, interact with our healthcare system. Our healthcare system is a mess, and the truth is that the Obamacare is not going to be the last reform that we have within the healthcare system. I think we're going to reform it again in a significant way within the next 10 years. And I think that reform is more likely to come from the right as opposed to the left. I think that they essentially took their best shot. And the moment that the president decided not to include a public option within the plan, and to instead rely on essentially a nationalization of the Romney Care model, I think it was a dramatic mistake for the Democrats to sort of go along with that. I think they could have gotten something that had more bipartisan buy-in. If they had traded essentially some of the things that they had in Obamacare that they ultimately passed for some of the steps that the Republicans wanted, that the right wanted in terms of creating a more competitive market-based system for the middle class. I think one of the things that we underestimate about Obamacare's problems is that it requires a level of buy-in in the future from moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats that I don't think actually is there. And I think that once you're up against it within the fiscal side, there's going to be a lot of pressures to reform or change the system. What does this all mean? I think all it means is that within the next decade, I think you are going to see additional reforms of healthcare. I think you are going to see particularly additional reforms of Medicaid. And I think that Obamacare as a whole is going to be something that, even though progressives and the left as a whole has bought in completely to the idea of defending it to the hilt, to the point where now we have these people who we never thought, would be arguing such a thing, out there, defending bailouts for insurers and saying they're not really bailouts. They're just responses to the to the needs of the program and that sort of thing. That's all well and good, but I think it's just sort of an amazing shift away from the kind of approach that they had in the past. And I think that the failures of Obamacare are such that they eliminate the ability really of the left to push for what their dream has always been. Instead, we're ending up in a situation where it's the worst of both worlds. It's an unsustainable situation. It's one that actually hurts people's lives and hurts their livelihood, that diminishes their likelihood of having a fulfilling and healthy life, and that doesn't actually deliver in terms of the peace of mind that it's supposed to be offering in insuring against risk and insuring against catastrophe. So I guess my view of Obama as a president, if it really does hinge on sort of Obamacare and people's view of it, I don't think that Obamacare is the great society. I don't think that we're here, sitting here 50 years from now, sort of saying, well, that Obamacare, all we need to do is tweak it and give it more competitive bidding because that'll make it better, which is the equivalent of what we're doing within Medicare. I just don't think that that's the case. I think that Obamacare is something that's far less sustainable politically and as a policy, and I think that there's going to be ramifications for decades to come because of the mistake that the president made in pursuing it as opposed to engaging in what I think was a huge opportunity for him, which was essentially a remaking of the tax code according to progressive wet dreams and things of that nature. I think he missed his opportunity as a president to have a far bigger impact domestically within the first few years of his presidency than he ended up having, in part because he chose to pursue the kind of bailout strategies and to promote Obamacare as a method of reforming our healthcare system instead of engaging in sort of a comprehensive economic remaking of the country along the kind of lines that I think a lot of progressives would like today.
Right. I think we could have I would defend the basic structure. I would defend Obamacare as defensible, but and you would defend it as unsustainable. We can have that debate another day. I think we're about out of time, but thanks a lot for joining me, Ben, and I will see everyone else next time on Blogging Heads.